Step back in time and rediscover 30 poor man meals from old cookbooks, humble dishes born from thrift, creativity, and survival. These forgotten recipes fed families, built memories, and stretched every dollar. Born from necessity in the 1930s, tomato gravy on bread was a go-to for struggling families. It wasn't fancy, but it filled bellies and made use of whatever was on hand. Tomatoes, often canned or homegrown, were stewed with flour, water, and a bit of lard or bacon grease, then poured over day-old bread. Sometimes onions were added, or milk if there was any to spare. It was hot, comforting, and made a meager pantry feel more generous than it was. Kids loved it because it looked like spaghetti sauce. Adults appreciated how it stretched nothing into something. This dish often showed up in church cookbooks and community recipe swaps, each with its own twist. Today it might not sound gourmet, but it tells a powerful story. When money ran dry, flavor and love still found a way. Reviving it is like tasting resilience with every bite. Cornmeal mush was once a kitchen staple in working-class homes across America. Simple, hearty, and endlessly adaptable, it began as a basic mix of water, salt, and cornmeal. Cooked slowly until thick and smooth, it could be eaten warm like porridge or chilled in a pan, sliced and fried the next day. Served with molasses, syrup, or even canned milk, cornmeal mush was a breakfast, lunch, or dinner depending on what the pantry held. In Southern and Appalachian communities, it was beloved for its affordability and the fact that one bag of cornmeal could last for weeks. It didn't pretend to be fancy, but that's what made it great. Leftovers became tomorrow's meal with no complaints. In today's world of packaged cereals and frozen waffles, this old-school standby deserves a second look. It was economical, nourishing, and surprisingly satisfying, proof that humble food, made with care, can be just as comforting as any modern meal. Popular in Eastern European immigrant households, cabbage and noodles, known in old cookbooks as haluski, was comfort food at its most basic. Shredded cabbage was sautéed slowly in butter or lard until golden and tender, then tossed with egg noodles or even scraps of homemade dough. Salt and pepper were usually the only seasoning. Meat was rare, unless you were lucky enough to have bacon ends or sausage drippings. Still, it fed entire families for pennies and offered warmth during long winters. This dish didn't pretend to be elegant, it just had to fill you up and keep you going. It became a staple in old Catholic cookbooks, especially during Lent when meat was forbidden. Today, haluski lives on at community festivals and church suppers, but fewer people make it at home. One bite, though, and you'll remember why it mattered. It turned two simple ingredients into a bowl full of satisfaction and survival. But next up, a forgotten casserole made from crushed crackers and hope. Cracker casserole was the embodiment of use what you've got. Found in frayed Depression-era cookbooks, it was made by crushing saltine or soda crackers and layering them with whatever was available. Canned tomatoes, onions, leftover vegetables, and, if lucky, a few shreds of cheese or canned meat. A splash of milk or broth was poured on top, then it was baked until golden and bubbling. Housewives called it poor man's lasagna or cupboard pie. What it lacked in elegance, it made up for in practicality. It used stale crackers instead of pasta and stretched a few pantry items into a filling dinner. In tough times, nothing was wasted, not even crumbs. Recipes varied from family to family, but the soul was the same. Make do and make it tasty. Today it might raise eyebrows, but back then, it brought people to the table and kept them full. Sometimes survival came topped with breadcrumbs and baked in a pie dish. This wasn't just a meal, it was a strategy. In mid-century kitchens, particularly during post-war rationing, potato and hot dog hash was a working family's standby. Diced potatoes were fried until crisp, then joined by chopped onions and sliced hot dogs. It was fast, cheap, and didn't require a trip to the store. When eggs were available, a fried egg was cracked right on top to finish it off. The flavor came from browning. Every bit of caramelization added richness to an otherwise modest plate. This dish filled up lunchboxes, fed night shift workers, and made use of two of the most budget-friendly staples, tubers and mystery meat. You won't find it in fancy cookbooks, but in spiral-bound community compilations and hand-me-down recipe cards. It's a classic. It represented ingenuity and a refusal to let dinner fall apart even when the budget did. Reviving this humble hash today is like bringing your grandparents' kitchen back to life, one crispy bite at a time. Did your family have a go-to whatever's in the fridge meal like this? Share your kitchen memories with us in the comments. Yes, it sounds strange, but this recipe appeared in more than a few old-budget cookbooks, particularly those printed during wartime rationing. Peanut butter stuffed onions were exactly what they claimed to be. Large onions hollowed out, filled with a mixture of peanut butter, breadcrumbs, and a pinch of herbs, then baked until soft and fragrant. It was a meat substitute, intended to provide protein in bulk when meat was scarce or unaffordable. The peanut butter became creamy and savory, while the baked onion mellowed into sweetness. It wasn't anyone's first choice, but it worked, and surprisingly well, according to those who grew up on it. Found in Red Cross pamphlets and thrift-focused cookbooks from the 1940s, it's a glimpse into how creativity emerged from constraint. While it never became mainstream, it holds a quirky charm and a deep respect for the resourcefulness of past generations. One bite, and you can almost hear a mother in an apron saying, "Eat up, it's good for you." But just ahead, we dig into a dish that turned leftover gravy into a whole new meal. Milk toast was once the ultimate comfort food for sick days, cold mornings, or empty cupboards. Found in nearly every pre-1950s American cookbook, it involved nothing more than toasted bread soaked in warm milk, sometimes sweetened with sugar and cinnamon, other times seasoned with salt and pepper for a savory twist. In hard times, it replaced cereal, oatmeal, and even soup. The bread, often stale, was revived by the hot milk, making it soft and filling. It was also gentle on the stomach, making it a favorite for children and the elderly. In homes where dairy was one of the few reliable ingredients, milk toast provided warmth and nourishment. While modern palates might call it bland, back then, it was beloved and deeply symbolic. It represented care, gentleness, and the ability to create comfort from next to nothing. Recreating it today is like opening a window to a quieter, simpler kitchen where love simmered on every back burner. Gravy bread was a no-fuss, no-frills meal that came from scraping the last bits of dinner into something new. In households where nothing went to waste, leftover pan drippings or gravy, no matter how little, were poured over slices of stale bread to create a rich, savory, make-do dish. If there was meat involved, it was usually yesterday's roast scraps or sausage bits cooked into the gravy. But even without it, the flavors clung to the bread, turning it into something comforting and deeply satisfying. This meal showed up everywhere: rural farms, inner-city row houses, immigrant neighborhoods, because it didn't require money, just heat and heart. Kids loved it for the saltiness and warmth. Adults appreciated that it cost almost nothing. Sometimes topped with an egg or reheated beans, gravy bread was more than a recipe. It was a ritual, a way of saying, "There's still something here. We'll make it work." And make it work they did. Foraging wasn't trendy, it was survival. In many old cookbooks, especially from Appalachian and rural traditions, dandelion greens were treated like a springtime gift. Free, abundant, and nutrient-rich, they were gathered by hand and cleaned carefully. Boiled briefly to soften their bite, they were then sautéed in leftover bacon grease or lard until wilted and fragrant. If vinegar was available, a splash brightened the dish. Sometimes chopped boiled egg was added. This wasn't side salad fare. It was often the centerpiece of a meal. Families paired it with cornbread or potatoes to stretch the serving. Dandelion greens reminded families of the changing seasons and taught children that food didn't always come from a store. It came from the earth, the yard, the field, and it was enough. Today, these recipes are rare, tucked into handwritten margins and church cookbook footnotes. But they're worth reviving because they're not just meals. They're stories of how people lived with less and still fed each other with pride. Also known as poor man's lemon pie, vinegar pie was a Depression-era dessert miracle. When citrus was too expensive or unavailable, clever home cooks replaced lemon juice with a few spoonfuls of vinegar, and somehow it worked. Sugar, butter, flour, and water were boiled into a custard-like filling, then balanced with white or apple cider vinegar for tang, poured into a basic crust, and baked until golden. It came out tasting surprisingly bright and complex, sweet, tart, and slightly creamy. The recipe originated in 19th century prairie cookbooks, but surged in popularity during the Dust Bowl and Great Depression. It was one of many desperation pies, like mock apple or water pie, that made something delicious from next to nothing. Today, vinegar pie is a hidden gem, nearly forgotten outside of historical societies and southern kitchens, but it deserves a comeback. One bite and you'll realize, poverty didn't crush creativity, it ignited it. Which of these forgotten dishes would you dare to cook, or have you already tasted one? Let us know in the comments. Mock chicken legs, also known as city chicken, originated in the industrial Midwest during the 1920s and 30s when actual chicken was expensive, but pork and veal were cheaper. Chunks of meat were skewered on wooden sticks, breaded and fried or baked to resemble drumsticks. They were often seasoned with whatever a household had on hand: salt, pepper, garlic powder, or mustard. Despite having no poultry, the illusion was strong enough that it satisfied cravings for Sunday dinners on a Tuesday night budget. This dish became a staple in Polish and Slovak communities, especially in cities like Pittsburgh and Detroit. It's featured in countless church and union cookbooks, always slightly different but lovingly familiar. Today, the tradition is fading as real chicken became more affordable. But back then, this mockery of a meal offered a bit of pride and joy during lean times. Because sometimes pretending was enough, and when seasoned right, these sticks of hope tasted just like the real thing. Cornbread mush took a budget staple and gave it new life with a hot skillet and a little grease. Made by cooking cornmeal with water or milk into a thick porridge, it was then poured into a loaf pan to set overnight. The next day, it was sliced and fried in bacon fat or oil until golden and crispy on the outside, creamy on the inside. Eaten plain, drizzled with syrup, or topped with leftover gravy, it was a Depression-era favorite. Families especially loved it during the winter months. It was cheap, hot, and stick-to-your-ribs filling. Fried mush showed up in Appalachian kitchens, Southern cookbooks, and rural diners alike. Kids often didn't realize it was yesterday's leftovers, just that it was warm, crunchy, and served with love. It proves that creativity wasn't optional. It was required, and it's still delicious today, especially when nostalgia is the secret ingredient. But just ahead, we uncover a shockingly simple supper that once relied entirely on a single can of beans. Yes, you read that right. In homes where meat was scarce and budgets even tighter, baked bean sandwiches were an all-American fix. Using canned or homemade baked beans, sweet, smoky, or just plain, families would spread them onto slices of white bread and top them with a second slice. Sometimes the beans were mashed to prevent spills. Other times, they were left whole, dripping and messy. It wasn't elegant, but it got the job done. These sandwiches appeared in school lunches, factory break rooms, and Sunday suppers alike. The trick was in the bread. Slightly stale slices held up better under the weight of warm beans. A bit of mustard, relish, or chopped onion might be added if available. Found in early 20th century budget cookbooks, it's a dish that shows how even the most humble ingredients can be shared. Today, it might raise eyebrows, but back then, a baked bean sandwich meant no one went hungry, and that was enough. Eggs and rice might seem like a breakfast side today, but during lean times, it was dinner. Often found in wartime cookbooks and small-town recipe cards, the dish used two humble staples: cooked rice and scrambled or fried eggs. Sometimes soy sauce, ketchup, or a splash of milk was added, depending on what was available. Meat was rare, though scraps of bacon or a single hot dog were chopped in when possible. The simplicity of egg and rice dinner made it perfect for families with limited resources and big appetites. Kids could eat their fill, and parents didn't have to spend more than a few cents. Asian American households perfected their own versions of this dish too, often elevating it with garlic or scallions. Whether seasoned or plain, the meal represented what many families knew well: survival through simplicity. It may have come from necessity, but it stayed for its ease, warmth, and ability to stretch almost nothing into something wonderful. Water pie is one of the most jaw-dropping recipes in Depression-era cookbooks, and yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. Born in the Dust Bowl when pantries were bare and sugar was rationed, water pie used boiling water, flour, sugar, butter, and vanilla to create a gel-like custard baked inside a basic crust. That's it. No milk, no eggs, just clever chemistry. As it cooled, the watery filling thickened into a silky sweet dessert that mimicked a true custard. It was surprisingly good for something that sounded like a dare. Mothers made it to prove that dessert could still be possible, even when everything else seemed impossible. The recipe survived by being passed down on index cards, clipped from newspapers, or scribbled in the back pages of community cookbooks. It's a testament to the resilience of the American kitchen, where even boiling water became a treat when poured into a crust of hope. Which of these poor man meals has your family kept alive, or are you inspired to try one out yourself? Let us know below. When cupboards were nearly bare, buttered noodles with cracker crumbs stepped in as a warm, simple solution. Found in frugal cookbooks from the early 1900s to the post-war era, this dish used only 3 essentials: pasta, butter, and crushed saltines. The noodles were boiled, then tossed in melted butter, sometimes margarine or bacon fat in leaner homes. A generous handful of crushed crackers added crunch and just enough flavor to make it feel like more than it was. Some families added onion powder, pepper, or dried herbs if available, but often it was served just as is. It wasn't gourmet, it was honest. Served on chipped plates at kitchen tables across America, it fed kids after school, soothed stomachs before bed, and stretched small amounts of food into something bigger than the sum of its parts. Today, you might call it comfort food. Back then, it was just dinner, served with gratitude, and maybe a second helping if there was enough. Oatmeal wasn't just for breakfast, it was the backbone of many poor man's meatloaves during hard times. Found in countless 1940s and 50s cookbooks, oatmeal was used to stretch small amounts of ground beef or pork into a full loaf. The oats absorbed flavor and moisture, giving structure without the cost of breadcrumbs or eggs. A simple mix of meat, oats, onion, milk, and seasoning was packed into a pan and baked until firm. A ketchup glaze on top added sweetness and tang if it could be spared. Meatloaf night was an event in struggling households. 1 pound of meat became enough for everyone, with leftovers for sandwiches the next day. The oatmeal version may not have been flashy, but it was filling, frugal, and full of love. Kids didn't know it was a budget trick, they just knew it smelled good. Today, we call it retro. Back then, it was resilience baked into every warm, savory slice. Onions were often the only fresh produce in a poor household's pantry, and they became the base of countless old-world soup recipes. One standout was onion soup with bread dumplings, a dish that came from European immigrant kitchens and found its way into community cookbooks during the Great Depression. Onions were slowly caramelized in lard or butter, then simmered in water or thin broth. Bread dumplings, made from stale bread cubes, flour, egg, and a splash of milk, were dropped into the pot, puffing up as they cooked. The result was hearty and comforting, stretching just a few onions into a full pot of food. The broth was simple, but the flavors were deep. It was a meal that cost almost nothing but warmed you completely. Many families passed this recipe down quietly, never expecting it to survive beyond hard times. But in every bowl was a history lesson, a story of thrift, care, and doing the best with what you had. But wait until you see what one family made from leftover macaroni, and get this, applesauce. Strange? Maybe. But for many families in the 1930s and 40s, macaroni applesauce bake was a real dish, and it worked. Found in regional cookbooks from the Midwest and Appalachia, it combined cooked elbow macaroni, unsweetened applesauce, a little sugar, and cinnamon. Sometimes a pinch of salt or a splash of milk was added. Baked until warm and slightly crisp on top, the result was a mildly sweet, chewy casserole that walked the line between dinner and dessert. It often appeared on Fridays, when pantries were low and creative thinking took over. Kids thought it was a treat. Parents knew it was another way to stretch leftovers and use what was already in the house. It might sound odd today, but it was delicious to those who grew up on it, especially served warm with a pat of butter melting on top. A little weird? Sure, but in kitchens built on necessity, flavor came from imagination and love. A budget staple for generations, liver and onions was a dish that sparked strong opinions, but no one denied its nutritional punch or its affordability. Found in every old cookbook from wartime to the 1970s, beef or pork liver was one of the cheapest proteins available. Sliced and pan-fried in bacon grease or oil, it was served with deeply caramelized onions to balance the liver's strong flavor. Some families soaked the liver in milk beforehand to mellow the taste. Served with mashed potatoes or rice, it was rich, filling, and packed with iron. Kids might have turned up their noses, but for many households, it was a reliable, nourishing meal when money was tight. Liver and onions also carried a kind of pride, a sense that you were feeding your family something hearty, even if it wasn't everyone's favorite. Today, it's rarely served outside of diners or nostalgia-driven kitchens, but it was once a poor man's steak, served with quiet dignity. Did you grow up with any of these dishes, or have you passed one on to your own family? Tell us in the comments, we'd love to hear your stories. Yes, water. This ultra-simple version of scalloped potatoes came from times when milk and cheese were luxuries, not staples. Found in wartime and Depression cookbooks, it layered thinly sliced potatoes with a little flour, salt, pepper, and margarine or bacon fat. Instead of milk or cream, hot water was poured over the dish, allowing the potatoes to bake until soft and golden. Sometimes onions were added for flavor. the top crisped up while the inside stayed tender and starchy. It might sound plain, but it was filling and warm, and that counted for everything. Families served it with canned green beans, bread heels, or nothing at all. The key was baking it slowly, letting the humble ingredients transform into something far more satisfying than the sum of its parts. Today, we might reach for cheese or heavy cream, but back then, water and a little faith were enough to turn potatoes into a full-blown family dinner. And just ahead, an unexpected dessert made from stale crackers and a splash of maple. You won't find a more famous Depression-era dessert trick than mock apple pie. First popularized by Ritz and printed in cookbooks throughout the 1930s, this pie mimicked the flavor and texture of apples, with zero fruit. The apples were actually crushed saltine crackers, layered in a basic pie crust and soaked in a syrup made from sugar, lemon juice, cinnamon, and cream of tartar. When baked, the crackers softened and took on a texture shockingly close to stewed apples. Served with whipped cream or nothing at all, it amazed guests who had no idea they weren't eating real fruit. It became a symbol of culinary illusion, a bit of magic for families who couldn't afford the real thing. While it faded from mainstream cookbooks, it lives on in retro communities and vintage recipe clubs. One bite, and you understand. Necessity didn't just birth invention, it birthed dessert. And in the poorest of kitchens, this pie was a sweet little miracle. Boiled dinner wasn't glamorous, but it was practical, flexible, and used every bit of what you had. Common in New England and Irish-American homes, this dish boiled cheap cuts of meat, like salt pork or beef brisket, with cabbage, carrots, onions, and potatoes, all in one big pot. The result was soft, flavorful, and hearty enough to feed a crowd. In leaner times, meat might be left out entirely, and the broth flavored only with bones or salt. Some called it clean out the icebox stew. It appeared in every old cookbook under a dozen names: Yankee dinner, Irish boil, poor man's stew. But the heart of it was always the same. Use what's left and stretch it. The broth was saved for the next day, the vegetables mashed for leftovers, and every drop was accounted for. Today, it's hard to imagine a pot of boiling cabbage as exciting, but back then, it meant dinner was on, and no one would leave hungry. When pasta met pantry, tomato macaroni stew came to life. This simple stovetop meal was found in dozens of mid-century cookbooks and was often the first recipe young cooks learned in poor households. Macaroni noodles were boiled, then added to a simmering pot of canned tomatoes, onions, and a little lard or butter. If there was ground meat, it went in. If not, no problem. Salt, pepper, and garlic were the usual seasonings, but even plain, it satisfied. The tomatoes gave acidity and sweetness. The pasta gave bulk. Together, they created a dish that could be reheated for days. This wasn't goulash. It was rougher, plainer, and born of pure function. Some families added beans. Others used tomato soup instead of sauce. The goal was always the same: feed everyone, waste nothing. It filled stomachs and warmed kitchens, and in its humble way, kept families going. Today, it tastes like memory and maybe a little bit of magic in a pot. Before takeout made fried rice trendy, many families made their own version, with whatever they had. The most basic variation? Fried rice and onions. Leftover rice was sautéed in lard or drippings with a chopped onion and seasoned with salt and pepper. If a carrot or egg was on hand, it joined the party. Some versions added soy sauce, if someone had a bottle, but often it was just simple, savory, and cheap. This dish wasn't Asian cuisine, it was pure survival. Found in rural and urban kitchens alike, it taught resourcefulness. Leftover rice never went to waste. Onions added sweetness and depth, while the frying created crispy edges that kids loved. It often doubled as breakfast or a midnight snack. Though the ingredients were modest, the comfort it delivered was immense. Today it's easy to overlook such a humble dish, but those who grew up with it know it wasn't just food, it was security in a skillet. Which of these meals has a place in your family's story? Or which one will you try just for the nostalgia? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your memories. Ketchup soup might sound like a joke today, but it was deadly serious during the Great Depression. Found in emergency cookbooks and passed down by word of mouth, it used ketchup, hot water, and a bit of margarine or onion to create a hot, slightly tangy broth. Some versions added saltines or cooked pasta for body. Others used evaporated milk to create a creamy variation. It wasn't luxurious, it was pure improvisation. The dish is famously associated with soup kitchens and hobo camps, but it was also made in suburban homes where the grocery money ran out too soon. Kids didn't always know what it was. They just knew it was warm, red, and strangely tasty. Today, ketchup soup is a forgotten footnote in the history of culinary thrift, but back then, it filled bellies and gave dignity to empty shelves. It wasn't about flavor, it was about hope. Sometimes, just having something warm to sip made all the difference. Old cookbooks are full of ways to repurpose leftovers, and leftover oatmeal cakes were among the most beloved. If breakfast porridge went uneaten, thrifty cooks mixed it with flour, sugar, baking powder, and fat to create hearty little skillet cakes. Fried until crisp and golden on both sides, they were served plain, with syrup, or dusted with powdered sugar if you had any. Some households flavored them with cinnamon or raisins. Others used lard and salt for a more savory bite. These cakes stretched food, avoided waste, and gave kids a treat without costing another dime. Oatmeal cakes were especially common in coal country, farming communities, and among first-generation immigrants who knew how to make every grain count. They were a reminder that nothing, not even cold cereal, went in the trash. Today, they're almost extinct, but every once in a while someone's grandma pulls out the cast iron and brings them back. And when she does, you're in for something special. But before we close the book, let's uncover one more dessert born from ration stamps and cupboard scraps. This dish took pantry basics and turned them into sweet, creamy comfort. Found in nearly every old world cookbook, poor man's rice pudding used leftover rice, sugar, water, or milk, and a touch of cinnamon. Eggs and raisins were luxuries, added only if the week was good. The rice simmered low and slow, releasing its starch to thicken the liquid and turn it into something like custard. It was often served warm on Sunday nights, sometimes with a splash of evaporated milk or a dab of jelly. Some versions baked it in the oven until the top browned and bubbled. For immigrant families and rural households, it was a beloved dessert because it was cheap, satisfying, and tasted like more than it cost. It was the good stuff you made from nothing. Today's puddings are loaded with cream and flavorings, but the original still holds up. It's not just dessert. It's a sweet, steaming bowl of history and home. Sometimes, the simplest things left the biggest imprint. Bread and milk was a staple across generations. A bowl of torn-up bread soaked in cold or warm milk, sprinkled with sugar or cinnamon if you were lucky. It was breakfast, dinner, or dessert, depending on what else the family had. Found in turn-of-the-century cookbooks and wartime homemaker guides, it became synonymous with humble nourishment. Some families made it sweet, others savory with salt and pepper. A few poured coffee over it for the adults. It required no stove, no baking, just a bowl, a spoon, and whatever bread hadn't gone stale. It was comforting in its simplicity, a quiet hug from the pantry. Kids might have sighed when it showed up again, but deep down, it meant someone was looking out for them. It meant home. Today, bread and milk feels like a relic, but for those who remember it, it's also a reminder of resilience, frugality, and unconditional love. Sugar sandwiches were the ultimate poor man's treat. When cupboards ran bare of lunch meat, peanut butter, or jam, families reached for the cheapest ingredients they had: butter, or margarine, and white sugar. Spread between two slices of bread, it was sweet, quick, and shockingly satisfying to a hungry child. Some versions used brown sugar or a sprinkle of cinnamon for extra flavor. Found in Depression-era lunchboxes and passed down through handwritten recipe cards, this sandwich showed up when nothing else did. It was dessert, snack, or even dinner in hard times, and it never pretended to be more. Today, it might sound unhealthy or strange, but back then, it felt like a little joy amid struggle. Kids looked forward to it. Moms packed it with love, knowing it wasn't perfect, but it was something. And something, in those days, was everything. Did sugar sandwiches or rice pudding show up in your childhood kitchen? Share your story in the comments. We're celebrating them all. I hope you enjoyed this flavorful trip through history's humblest meals. Which one brought back memories or sparked curiosity? These dishes deserve remembering, one simple bite at a time. Until next time.